This week, we're going to dive into a topic that is so important in today's culture, mental health. It can be really hard to talk about, but we need to have conversations about it, especially how it relates to our walk with God. We'll be joined by BJ Thompson, a life coach, speaker, and author, who, with the help of Grammy Award-winning artist Lecrae, helped launch the 116 movement, one of the largest faith movements in recent history. He earned a master's degree in Christian studies from Union University, and he's super passionate about racial reconciliation and helping people all over the world experience personal and relational growth. He currently serves as a director for Build a Better Us and lives in Atlanta with his wife and their 3 children. Here's BJ Thompson.
All right. It must be my birthday out here. As exciting as you guys are. Where my gamers at? Oh, yeah. Okay. 2K, anybody play 2K? Yeah. Okay, all right. Everybody playing 2K in this room. Anybody playing Fortnite? What about the Fortnites? Any Fortnite? Okay, that's like the new thing. All the rappers and everybody cool is playing Fortnite, right? A few years ago, I was with a friend, and we would regularly play games. We would play a first-player shooter game. And I remember every day we would play this game and would talk about life as we were playing. That close friend, as he decided to enlist in an army and go to that hostile country for more than a year, he came back and we were sitting down playing this game. And he had on the same clothes, he was working at the same job, and yet he was not the same person, right? Here's what I didn't know, that something on the inside that had shifted was not evident on the outside of the life that he was beginning to live. And this is what happens when we begin to experience change in our mentality. If we go through traumas, if we go through divorces, when we go through real incidents in real life, we find ourselves looking the same outwardly, but inwardly something about us has begun to grow and experience something very differently than what we had imagined before. This is a disclaimer because today I'd like to talk about mental health. And I want to give a disclaimer, right? The Bible does talk about mental health, but I am not a licensed therapist or medical counselor. If you are having issues with your mental health and you need to see a physician, make sure you stop and go see a physician. Is that okay? Okay, I want to make sure I say that. But here's my goal today. My goal today is to dispel the misconception that mental health is somehow separate from our overall walk with God. You see, you ever experienced this thought and this idea that when you think about mental health, it's somewhere in a separate category from your faith, right? That now you need to kind of bridge the gap, run a couple of layers over in life in order to create some type of continuity, when really mental health is a part of the being of how God made us, right? And so what I want to do today, for us, is to begin to talk about mental health in a way that brings encouragement, that brings hopes, that brings resources, and that allows us to begin to deal with the issues that plague us on a regular basis, right? Here's the word mental health defined. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, it affects how we feel and how we act. It also helps determine how we handle stress and relate to others. When you think about mental health is essentially how we feel and then the responses that then are produced as a result of how we feel. There's this thought that I give in talks when I say that everything starts with your feeling, but then that feeling turns into a belief, and then that belief leads to a behavior, right? Here's the misconception that we often deal with, though. We deal with the misconception that somehow, because we have been made new in Christ, like the text says, it says, the old has passed away, behold, the new has come. We believe that this idea of the old passing away means that anything that we have dealt with up until that point is no longer a factor. And I'm here to tell you today that you could be a person that's born new in Jesus Christ and yet still have genuine, authentic struggles with your mental health. When we think about mental health, again, shouldn't be a badge of shame, but it's an issue that we're able to deal with as we begin to grow over time, right? Anybody grow up with a bunch of boxes unpacked in their house? Anybody? My mama's garage is filled with boxes right now, right? You walk in there, there's boxes, right? And nobody knows what's in these boxes, right? It's like a treasure hunt, right? Like you walk in, you open a box, and you find something you ain't seen it. You're like, oh, wow, I haven't seen this in 20 years, right? Like, it's a treasure hunt, right? But don't we do the same thing with trauma in our life? That if you go and you open up some of these incidents and memories and things in our lives, you would find stuff you haven't seen in years, right? I think this happens because we put these things, these unlabeled things, into a box, right? So maybe you put your childhood trauma in a box, right? Or maybe you put the abuse that you've experienced in a box, or maybe struggles with chemical imbalance into a box, or poor decision making. Maybe anybody else have made some poor decisions. I'm the only one that made some poor decisions, right? Poor decision making in a box. And then we look and we've accumulated so many boxes that we've never even thought about opening now, right? I know this is a serious subject, but do y'all want to hear a joke? All right, cool. All right. A man decided one day to go swimming at a lake. And at that same moment, a fish was swimming by. So he asked him, he said, "Hey, how's the water?" The fish looked up, turned to the man, and he looked confused, and he said, "What's water?" Right? So it is when we fail to process soberly our past and our trauma, right? What water is to a fish is what trauma is to a person that has not honestly processed their past, right? And so when we talk about trauma, we're not just talking about walking over and dealing with things, because we have a new present situation. We're talking about all the things that we have in our life. And here's the problem with that. When we fail to unpack those boxes, they just begin to stack themselves up, and they don't allow us to be healed, right? But God says this: the more we're truly healed, the more we'll understand our purpose as we begin to engage our trauma. Is that all right? Yeah. Good. Okay. When you get older and you realize over time that relationships create new changes, right? So your relationship with school, when you leave college, it opens up a box. Or you get sick, it may open up a box. Or you get married, it may open up a what, y'all? A box, right? Many times we don't expect for those boxes to be open. They just end up getting open because of an incident or a change of season in our lives, right? And so there's a couple things that happen when you think about trauma in the boxes, right? We think like, oh, I forgot about that, so it doesn't exist anymore. But your brain and your body is actually keeping a score, right? There is a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is like a file cabinet, keeping all your memories, okay? And then there is this thing called the limbic brain, which is, that's too much for y'all? Can I not? Huh? I'm gonna run it, okay? Right? There's a thing called the amygdala that begins to send out chemicals and responses every time you see that thing that triggers that memory, right? Here's what happens when you have trauma. Trauma can't go back in the file cabinet because it's too painful to put in and it doesn't make sense to the rest of your life, right? So what happens with trauma is when we see that thing that triggered trauma, our brain sends out whatever chemicals and stressors that we have as if it was the last day. You ever seen somebody you had a big blow up with and you hadn't seen them in years, but then you saw them again, you felt those same feelings? That's because our body is actually keeping the score. That's because we did not forget. You may have forgotten, but your body did not forget. And so what do we do when we begin to experience traumas that we can't categorize and we don't have a place for? We begin to adopt coping strategies. So it could be alcohol abuse. It could be substance abuse. It could be risky sexual behavior. It could be unhealthy attachment. You see, our coping habits don't make the issues go away. They merely are cologne over a stinky body. You ever smell somebody who dumped cologne over a body and they haven't taken a shower? That's not a good smell. That's not a good feeling, right? You see, you still smell bad, but you just have a hint of Donna Karen over your body, right? When we think about mental health and we think about the Bible has so much to say about mental health. And maybe I think it's because we don't talk about it enough that we miss it, right? Matthew 6:34 says this, so don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. 1 Peter says this, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Matthew 22:37 says this, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your what? Mind, soul, and strength. The Bible has plenty to say about mental health if we would allow it to speak, right? But despite all the truths about mental health and what it could say to us, oftentimes it's still hard to piece it together. Today, I'd like to look at Jesus himself and what he did. Please turn with me to Matthew chapter 4, verses 20 through 25. If you have an iPhone, we know you're there. If you have an Android, we're praying for you, right? All right? Y'all go ahead and get it out. All right, I'll read it. And it says this, and he went through all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout Syria, and they brought him all the sick and those afflicted with diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and healed them. And the great crowd followed him from Galilee and Decapolis, in Jerusalem and Judea, and beyond to the Jordan. You see, in Genesis 3, God promised to send his son as the seed who will crush the head of the serpent, right? And we see that he didn't just come to send his son as this seed who's going to just free our souls. He said that his son was going to redeem all people. And he was going to bring within himself healing of creation in the way that he's always intended. And that's in the mind, body, and the soul. So when you see Jesus show up to the culture, he doesn't just show up preaching the gospel. What does it say? He says he did what? He came and he healed what? All kinds of disease, sicknesses, and illnesses, right? People with demons, people having seizures, people who are paralytics, and he healed them, right? God not only cares about the liberation of our body, liberation of our souls, he cares about the health of our minds and our bodies. Here's a funny clip just to illustrate that which I'm saying.
These two again? I really hate to do this. Huh? Yikes! Spikes! Hey, you could have killed them.
It's funny, right? So this is the older movie called The Little Rascals. And in this movie, they're in this race. And they're going head to head. And unexpectedly, people are trying to sabotage the race. There are bad things that just happen, right? Isn't that true for those of us who live in a fallen world? That there's no way we can get around the difficult things that happen. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter your gender. It doesn't matter your race. It has no bearing on reality that we are all going to experience trial, right? And if you haven't gone through something so far, right, do what the old folks say. They say, if you haven't gone through anything, keep on what? Just keep on living, right? And so we cannot avoid pain. We cannot avoid difficulty. We cannot avoid things that could cause us trauma, right? If we had an idea of how our being works, I think we would be in a better space, right? We'd be able to experience and to engage this idea of trauma in a way that brings healing, wholeness, transformation, despite the fact that we're always being pressed in through difficulty, right? C.S. Lewis says this, just to kind of start this conversation. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, you are a soul with a body, not the body with a soul. Right? C.S. Lewis says this. He says, you are a soul with a body, not a body with a soul, right? And so think of it like this. Your soul, in a sense, is your driver, right? In your body, y'all like my steering wheel? Let's go, right? Just got my license, my permit, right? Our body, in some ways, is the vehicle, okay? My mind is the computer, okay? Let's just say this. Let's just say I'm driving my car and I run out of gas. What happens when you run out of gas? Car's gonna stop. I don't know what your car do when you run out of gas. My car stopped, right? Let's just say I'm driving and the computer starts to glitch, right? What will happen? It could crash. It could even catch on fire, right? Let's just say I'm driving and I fall asleep. What's going to happen, y'all? I'm going to die, right? It doesn't be die, right? Here's the thing. If that's true, why don't we take our own advice with our own bodies and beings, right? Some of us are neglecting our physical health and then blaming it on our spiritual health. Some of us are playing in sin. We're actually involved in things that grieve our souls, and yet we're taking medication to cover it up. Some of us have never dealt honestly and processed the past life and experiences and traumas, and we try to just get more involved in the church, right? But like a car, the more you neglect it, the more you fail to put in oil, you will find yourself unexpectedly having catastrophic blowouts over the duration of time, right? Here's the key. The key is this. The Father in heaven wants you to have the knowledge and wants you to have the tools so we can be the person that he's made us to be. Is that all right? I'll finish up with this. Maybe you're listening today and you say, BJ, what do I need to do? Because there's different things in my being. I have trauma. I have experiences. I realize that I have not been doing a good job with my mental health, right? It just depends on which piece of your being. So maybe you need to get the driver some sleep. I mean, maybe the car needs to rest, right? Maybe you need to get some sleep. Maybe you need to sit honestly with a therapist, right? You've been putting it off for so long. Now it's time to really be proactive in that arena, right? Maybe it's time for you to begin to engage your faith in a way that's transformational and not just transactional, right? All of these things create in us the wholeness of our being so that when it comes together, the driver, the computer, and the car, we can run in an optimal type of way, right? But did I tell you about the God factor? You haven't heard about the God factor? You see, there's something else that happens when you are in this car, right? That sometimes that there's an unexpected individual that will come and hitch a ride with you. Jesus said that he had to leave so that somebody could come called the Helper, the Holy Spirit. Now, this is what's profound about being in Christ. That the Helper goes and he gets into the car with you. He said this Helper will come and he'll give you power. So when you falling asleep, he'll tap you on the shoulder. When you find yourself getting lost, he'll lean over and whisper directions to you. When you find that your computer is struggling and glitching, You'll look up and the Spirit will give you just enough in order for you to get by and to move and to become who God has made you to be. You see, it's the Holy Spirit that's unique to this conversation of mental health because he brings about a transformation that no man can create. You want to know how to get that power and that spirit? You want to know? Yeah. All right. You want to know how to get that? You want to know how to get that healing power? Let's try it again. Do you want to know how to get that healing power? Yeah. Y'all ready? Repeat after me. Say, I am a mess. To the degree that you believe that you are a mess will be to the degree that you can experience God's grace. To the degree that you can believe that you are a mess is to the degree that you can experience God's grace. Remember, Jesus talked to the Pharisees and he says, you whitewash tombs. Only the sick need a physician. Why? They didn't believe that they were a what? A mess. And repeat after me. Say, and yet deeply loved by God. If you solely believe that you're just a mess, it'll drive you to grave depression. It'll drive you to hopelessness, right? When Jesus encountered the woman at the well, and she was so broken from her life and her decision making, why was he so kind to her? She knew that she was a mess. She didn't know that she was what? Deeply loved by God. When we bring those two things together, yet what? I am a mess, what? And yet what? Deeply loved by God. We can experience God's power in a way that we have never had before. Thank you. Thank you. Let's go ahead and take some time, and we'll do a Q&A, just briefly. Go ahead. Go ahead, man.
Thank you. What would be the best piece of advice you'd be able to give someone who feels that they may be lost in depression?
Good. That's a great question. So if you feel that maybe you could be experiencing depression, say something. I think oftentimes people suffer in silence. One of my favorite phrases now is, it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to suffer in silence. And so just begin to start that conversation, making people around you aware that you are sensing something. Because they can only read signs, they can't read minds. You need to be able to communicate that. So, yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Good. What other questions?
So what are some tips you would give for someone who's a friend of someone struggling with mental health? Like, how do you step into that situation without sounding judgmental or, just stepping on like a delicate ground, basically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you have a friend and you believe they are struggling with mental health and they need some care, reach out to them. I think one of the things is difficult about the mental health conversation is there's a lot of personal consent that has to take place. Unless a person has communicated self-harm, there's a lot of self-consent that has to occur before you can enter in. So if you're a friend and you see that, I would say, gently asking, hey, do you need help? How can I love? How can I serve you during this time? And then make it okay for them to see someone else. If once you hear that response, and maybe it's a lot, you go, man, this is a lot, then you can gently encourage them to go meet with someone else who has the credentials to be able to help them in that phase. And so, but I would definitely say there's a lot of personal consent that has to happen. But as a concerned friend, you can share with them, hey, just let me know if there's anything I can do to help serve you, respond to you in this process. So, yeah.
What should I do if I feel like I don't have anyone to talk to, no one's listening or taking me seriously?
It's a great question. So if you feel like completely alone, being alone is always an indicator that you're not known, right? And so when you feel like I'm not known, that's when vulnerability with someone has to take place. And so anytime we get to the spaces where like, man, nobody understands me, It's like, oh, because you're not being vulnerable. There's some things that if you would share, someone would understand, but it's just our own views, our own internal processing. We've overly internally processed something that has separated us and created more isolation. So I would say begin to fight for and ask for the courage to be able to speak out in as much vulnerability as you can with someone, so that hopefully you can be known and then begin to get whatever type of assistance, care, or help that you need. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think in the Christian world, it can seem like the answer to mental health is pray harder or believe more. And if you're not doing that, then something's wrong. So how can we dispel that or kind of continue the conversation to go forward from that?
Good. It's a great question. We can easily assume that because someone says that they're struggling with a certain thing, that they just need to go pray it away. And what I would say is, if someone broke their leg, right, you wouldn't tell them to go pray it away. You would say, hey, pray, but go to the hospital. And part of the issue is we make science and God, we put them at odds. But if God is the God of the universe, he is also the God of science, right? And so when we start talking about mental health and the need to encourage different tools and disciplines, there's Abraham Kuyper has this thing. He says it's not 1 square inch of the universe Jesus didn't say mind to, right? So that means science, that means arts, that means there's no area of life that doesn't belong to God. Therefore, when we submit ourselves to those different disciplines, we are still within the bounds of submitting ourselves to the Lord. So, well, guys, thank you guys so much for being here today and hearing this talk, hopefully this timely message on mental health. Thank you.
Guys, I am a mess and yet deeply loved by God. Such truth from BJ. There are many lies that we tend to believe about mental health, but the Bible gives us truth to combat these lies. This week, we want to offer you content that looks deeper into what it means to be a Christian and still struggle with mental health. By texting mHealth to 555-888, you'll receive an article about many of the myths and truths surrounding mental health. Thanks for joining us this week.